Okay, good. So everybody knows it's being recorded. Fantastic. Okay, so I think what we discussed last year on discussion about zero trust, and one of the topics we thought was of interest is the hybrid model, where you know that in the environment of zero trust, there are two truths that are very clear. One is it's an evolving model. You can't just do zero trust day one. It's going to take some time and effort to get there. And some of the material will also tell you that some systems will never approach zero trust, including mainframes and OT systems and so forth. So given that, one of the things that we observed in our work group meetings up to this point was, well, there seems to be a need for kind of how do we deal with the hybrid model where you've got zero trust in some of the environment and you don't have zero trust in the other environment. How do what does that look like? What does that mean? What kind of situations does that lead us to? And is there anything we can do to, help that along? Because I think it'll help both the migration from a current IT environment to zero trust, which, as we said, is going to evolve. It's not going to be one thing. So you're going to end up with hybrid, the first step, and then secondly is the roadmap of getting to that environment is a relatively complex one, especially zero trust, where most of the documentation identifies at least three things. Dennis, is identity is important, and data is important, and network's important. And we all know in security what the wonderful way things are managed. That's three silos immediately right there. And so, is there an opportunity there for figuring out some way of pulling that together? Is there some kind of approach that people can take so that as they evolve these systems, they can get to a zero trust model and understand how those three pillars are working and how they are effectively getting you to the end game of zero trust. So I think that's kind of the segment we're in, if that's fair, Dennis. And Dennis has been great to leading us here in these discussions. He sent some material out. I did send it to the group just before this meeting on some, I guess it's discussion points, Dennis. I know you spend a little bit of time talking to some other groups, so you wanted to share that as well. So I'll turn it over to you and, kind of take them through, what you've got up to this point and some of the discussions you've had.
Alrighty. Henry, before that, if I could.
Sure.
And not to bog you down, and hopeful answer is you'll just point me at something you have somewhere, but have you defined zero trust and what you mean by it is question one. And question two is, are you looking at it in the context of new projects or new sub-projects under the OCA banner to help with something? Or are you looking at it under the, hey, we have Stick Shifter, we have Kestra, we have Pace, we have whatever, and they'll need to change how they operate than how they used to operate because now zero trust does whatever? And the answer could be both, neither, or whichever. But so two questions. This first one's a two-part question. Thanks.
So to the first question, the material definition is already handled by somebody else. So we're not going to redefine it. Second is both.
So good. So that is somewhere, and you point to it, because my problem is it's defined by 6 different people, 6 different ways. Did you pick one of them?
If you look at the market, it is. The reason I
did this group pick one of them, so make it easy, just put a link in and say, this is the one we're using.
The group did not decide on one.
Okay.
What we did was focus our analysis on the one that has critical mass and Office of Management and Budget mandates behind it.
That's fine. You picked one. That's a good answer. Say you picked it. Just good. You picked one. Great.
Okay. I don't think it's the only one. It is the one.
No, I know. I'm just saying for our sake, for these meetings, at the moment, we've picked this one. Maybe we'll change our minds later.
At the moment works because that's the way these are going. So
just write that down somewhere. That's all I ask. It'll make life easier in the future.
Can you see? I'm not sure what you can see. What do you see?
You can see like a partial screen. Can you put it in screen show mode? That little
hold on once.
Get down the way down the bottom. There's a little screen looking thing way down the bottom there. You can click it and it'll go you full screen. There you go.
Did that do it?
Hey, yes, much better.
Perfect.
Is that better for you guys?
That's good.
Okay. So one of the core issues behind the scenes is that zero trust as a definition is evolving very fast when it comes to how do you implement it. It is very concrete with respect to its intentions and how it's supposed to work from a security model perspective. That is how it provides resilience, how it advances the 2 mandates that are behind the scenes. The first is do something about supply chain attacks. The second is do something effective about ransomware attacks. That is the gauge by which zero trust, and in fact, the whole executive order and all of the stuff behind it is going to be evaluated in the long run. The core issue is that we're not the only ones asking this question at all.
That's the root of why I brought up those issues.
The guys who have the mandate, the authority, and the market impact by definition, almost definition of the executive order, are NIST, CISA, and the NSA, with some additional extension recently into the non-federal space with the extension to the critical infrastructure, and especially FERC and NERC with the renovation of SIP, and then headed very hard in the international sector as of the recent European vote on the NIST 2 initiative. I think it was October 28th or so, empowering ENISA to do exactly what NIST is doing now with respect to cultivating both supply chain and cybersecurity advancements. In the US, the guys looking at the scope that we had described, what can we do with conventional available capabilities for existing application environments, are the guys at the NCCOE, the National Cybersecurity Centers of Excellence, under NIST in Rockville, Maryland. They've been running that effort for about 10 months now, and what they've been doing is taking the group of 23 collaborators, their technologies, beginning to look at how they can be assembled in ways that can be used to create a potential zero trust environment, something conformant to the definition or as conformant as it can be. The expectation right now is that they're starting in a crawl phase around identity-based zero trust. They know that there's no chance that an identity-centric approach will get to a complete zero trust solution, or at least one conformant to the definition. So what they're doing is finding out how far it can go by building it out and then doing verification of the results. There are 8 proposed constellations of the products that you see on the screen now, being configured and attached to various identity systems in order to be able to first identify where the gaps are in this, first from the NIST point of view. There is the expectation among the collaborators that somehow NIST will figure out how to do this, publish a practice guide, the SP 1800 guides, which are the things that give the good housekeeping seal of approval to a particular constellation of capabilities and playbooks in order to realize them in some sense. We probably are some distance from that because of the need to do some things technically in the parts that you see here in order to be able to get to something conformant with the NIST definition. But that's for that group's issue. The interesting thing, from my perspective, is that there seem to be a significant number of open source implementations of capability that might be isomorphic to what you see in capabilities that are sitting here. So the question began to arise, should someone be digging into an open source constellation of these kinds of capabilities to shadow exactly what NIST does with those SP 1800 guides in order to see how far we can push open source available technologies toward meeting exactly the same bar that will show up in the SP 1800 guides. The impact of this is that the SP 1800 guides are going to be the go-to guides for figuring out how do you meet the requirements of federal procurements. They will, in the long run, also be the guides that are shadowed by the audit agencies like ISACA, like NIST, the guys who train auditors to demonstrate attestation meets particular kinds of control requirements as their exemplars of what to do and what are the templates, if you will. So it becomes really interesting. They've gotten to the point where they've assembled the 8 candidate solutions and established the test environment. This is what the test environment looks like. It essentially establishes zones for 3 enterprise implementations of zero trust use cases. And the reason that there are 3 concurrent ones here is that there's a separate set of questions that come up in later working groups, I think use case 5 and 6 in NIST's list, that begin to focus on enterprise trust. So zero trust expressed as it goes across participating agencies and as it references trustability of partners, trustability of suppliers, trustability in a much broader sense, but still zero trust policy assertions. Zero trust being a policy statement that specifies only the subject and the thing they need access to, the object, and the criticality or importance with which that access is either granted or happens inappropriately. So to facilitate that, they're doing the setup and compare zero trust implementations, then operate some concurrently, and then look at the policy issues as they emerge across those multiple concurrent implementations. So this is the test environment that they're going to be using to build this out. We're heavily involved in lots of different parts of that.
So Dennis, one question on what you just said. So are those 3 instances of the same constellation or 3 separate constellations interacting with each other?
3 separate ones, and the reason is because they're looking for what abstractions will be in common among those implementations that allow them to reason and anchor policy across them at that higher level. So for example, if Amazon's providing a VPC in the isolation mechanism in one of these, and Microsoft on Azure is providing an ASE as the other isolation mechanism on a different one, you have 2 functionally equivalent isolation mechanisms that should be able to provide attestation that these things are isolated up to a higher level policy plane. They want to identify those abstractions and get into the what does that mean for zero trust when it's expressed across enterprises, across participants, where the architectures, the technologies, and those implementations might be very different. This is an attempt to host those different implementations in order to be able to ask and answer questions about policy at that higher level.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So the first question, I think, for the group that may be a consequence of those observations are first that I think it's worth the time to take that list of components that are going to make up these proposed implementations and try to identify, are there functional equivalents in open source? Things that do, for the purposes of zero trust implementation, analogous kinds of capability. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd like to spend some time figuring it out. And I think it's a useful thing to figure out because it enables the next one, which that is that if we do find such a cover, a set of alternatives, wouldn't it be interesting for this working group then to consider configuring and analyzing open source alternatives and evaluating them exactly the same way NIST does to establish that as a viable channel for being able to meet what will be a very broad-reaching set of business requirements going forward. That follows by an observation. We have the opportunity, if we can find a way to do that, to leverage what NIST has already done, sort of the definitional stuff that connects so tightly to the regulatory language, but separately to be able to leverage the tests and use cases so that we get comparable results. The value of that is to say this constellation provides equivalent protection because it's configured the same way and tested and evaluated the same way as other stuff in an interesting way. And then finally, if that's true, if the results of these are true, what I'd like to do is to consider whether we should forward to NIST a sketch of a proposal to collaborate on this based on that program of action, the identifying some equivalent capabilities in open source, configuring them, evaluating them doing it exactly the way NIST is proposing doing it in their NCCOE effort, but being able to weigh in on the dimension of how far were we able to get with open source. That isn't being done in the NIST effort. I don't know if any other groups might be doing it, for instance, the open groups. So that's another question worth asking. So that's sort of the agenda I had for consideration for today. But I wanted to note that there's some other stuff in progress. So at the back end of this deck, you have the last update we did, some of which is pending, in fact, all of which is pending on new updates coming from the multiple sources that are involved. The first is the NIST definition of how to implement the attestations and represent things like SBOM and the DevSecOps information that's got to feed the zero trust primitives at runtime, but also the CISA adoption of SBOM, the software bill of materials stuff that also winds up feeding part of zero trust, and the zero trust maturity model. Both of those have been now or are now under CISA authority, but we haven't seen much past that initial set of publications. We now also have ENISA empowered to do an awful lot of this. So on the global scale, the NIS2 initiative is a banner under which we're going to see probably a slightly more aggressive zero trust ambition, focusing as much on dependent services and services on which you rely for applications as they do parts and components, which is the current NIST focus, and then CISA focus, sorry. And then separately, the extension of this stuff beyond the federal footprint into critical infrastructure is going to expand stuff quite substantially as well. FERC and NERC both being front and center because of the embarrassing supply chain issues that we've been facing at the national level. So a bunch of contextual stuff follows. It's just the previous update. But I'd like to get at least you guys' reaction to whether or not this is worth doing and spinning up in the meantime. It's certainly something I can move forward in parallel with getting additional information as the definitional and implementation and regulatory stuff settles out over the next month or so.
This is Duncan with comments and questions. And sort of doing them in pop the stack in reverse order. I do think it's a good idea and do recommend going forward with it, but I do strongly recommend if we go forward with it, we make it a project, not just one of these random work groups that doesn't have a good governance definition at the moment, because once we open this can of worms, we're going to get probably some help, which will be good, but we probably want to have our ducks in a row on how we're going to handle it. But back to my questions I asked before we started recording on, hey, is this zero trust sort of new stuff because we want to make a new project to do it, which this sounds like yes, for this at least blessing part of it, I'll call it. But it also applies to, hey, the rest of our projects need to, do this stuff eventually too. And so if you answer your question one, if the answer is no, that's like a very bad thing, because that basically means we can't do any of the stuff we've currently been doing with, in other words, our current, stick shifter project and our current Kestrel project will require one of 8 vendors to give us a commercial product for it to work. And so hopefully, part of our work will be to hopefully determine the answer. If it isn't yet yes to number one, that we make sure it's eventually yes. But I'm hopeful the answer will be yes there. And then we should look at basically how to make this stuff work together. But I do think that that's a project, not a architecture work group work item. Over.
I think I agree. The work that I'm describing in the questions is concrete enough to make a project out of. And so I think you can describe what's the plan? How do you know you've gotten there, and what's the finish line look like? That's harder to do when we're asking these analytic questions. I think it's straightforward to do when we have a clear objective like
this. So Dennis, I'm still trying to figure out, for even just question one, what the benefits or the expected outcomes are. So I guess, we'd just be showing yet another potential implementation. Sure, it uses open source, but what's the industry benefit, or what's the next question we're trying to answer based on that? Other than we could do it.
Yeah, no, I think the only reason that I asked it was not so much that we needed a complete open source solution to zero trust that had the same kind of credibility that the NIST solutions are going to have with those practice guides. I think it was the other way, that open source was conspicuous by its complete absence in the previous constellation of stuff. So understanding the gap, that's the result, I think, of the first question, is the gap analysis. If we've got a cover, if there are equivalents in open source for everything, then it's not something being evaluated in NIST because there isn't a collaborator bringing that portfolio of stuff forward to get it in, right? There's nobody to participate in the collaboration that's happening at the NCCOE. That would be interesting in multiple fronts. The value, of course, is that it makes it easy to set something up and do an evaluation, for instance, in research environments and environments that are all open source oriented in some sense. But there's another observation. A large number of the participants in the NCCOE effort have a significant fraction of their portfolios based on open source stuff. So one way that we move the even commercial environments forward is by moving the open source capabilities forward concurrently. I think there are multiple dimensions of the benefit, although consumption of open source is changing. A very large fraction is being consumed together with the services required to do the building, the curation, the support, the evolution of the open source solutions. So I don't see a black and white difference. What I see in the NIST effort is an absence of any of the open source participating candidate technologies. Does that make sense?
And it also be true, you don't have to solve everything. Can't you solve at least part of it and we'd still be a success? Yeah.
I didn't make that clear in any of these questions, but I think that would be a natural consequence of getting to the answers. Suppose you can find three things that are equivalent. Go ahead.
I mean, I mean, what would be great, I think, to come out of it isn't just proving, hey, here's another list of potential options or tools that you could use instead of vendor XYZ, right? But also, if we unlock potential, pain points or things that could be done better, more efficiently, because, okay, we got it to work, but we had to spend so much time configuring this and translating that. Whereas if there was some other standard that allowed this thing to happen, this interchange, or, and I'm trying not to jump to a conclusion about what that might be, but I mean, and then we took that and said, now OCA is going to go and build, a standard around how to solve that pain point and push it either into those open source products, which would be great, and then it goes downstream as well, or force it hopefully into the vendor community and adoption, et cetera.
So I think that makes a ton of sense. I think there's no reason to suggest any of the open source products or would be a displacing factor to commercial participation. We're certainly not seeing that in the market evidence that's sitting there. More than that, we're seeing a ton of the commercial folks actually using the open source basis as a way to accelerate their own evolution and development. Separately, you got your finger on the pulse of the problem. One of the pieces of baggage that comes along with commercial products is the closed ecosystems that prevent or complicate the idea of doing integration and automation. Standards is one way to crack those wide open. And so you're not threatening anybody's business model by having standards-based conformance of an open source capability. In fact, you're accelerating its value in lots of ways. That could make it a place to more rapidly ask and answer the questions that emerge from open source implementation than NIST is finding possible in a commercial environment where the fragmentation, almost balkanization of the integration and automation capabilities is what they're facing. They're having to figure out how to configure and mash things together that weren't designed for that to occur. The standards are the grease that can move that forward. It just is a glaring omission that we don't see significant open source representation in those alternatives, but it's because of the model that NIST is pursuing and engaging the market.
And sort of an adjunct to that is the whole shifter. So instead of stick shifter, maybe it's something else shifter, or maybe there's 7 different versions.
Exactly.
Of this shifter and that shifter and this other shifter, but they're the connectors that let you that let you talk to this vendor X here and vendor Y there, because we convert them both into a standard, or maybe to begin with, we just have something in the middle to, hey, we'll let them talk to each other because we help with the open source to talk, IBM to IBM and Cisco to Cisco.
So
Is there a standard criteria and a set of measures, standards-based criteria, set of measures for functional equivalence? Equivalence?
But we do have a declaration by the guys who contributed the technologies of what they believe the relevance to the Zero Trust request from NIST was. And so they tried to connect the dots for why this product was providing a particular capability that met something of the 11 tenets required in the NIST definition. I think below that, we also have the evaluation matrices from the NCCOE of how these various potential solutions are going to be compared. And that can get us to effectiveness, some measure of efficacy that will cut across the various implementations as well. But I don't think it's a formal definition of what it took for a product to be put in place. It was simply what was the vendor's understanding of the mapping of this product into the 11 tenets and the desired characteristics, I think NIST called it, in the call for participation. And that's the only rationale applied right now. The utility of that rationale is becoming more clear as they attempt to do the integration now and get at the various interpretations of the vendors and how those weren't necessarily all consistent.
Is there a process for on-ramping potential open source things into the NCCOE environment?
If there's a sponsor, if there's a collaborator who's bringing that to the table, I believe they have a process that will work, but there hasn't been. What the folks who have applied for participation in the collaboratory and made the case for their technologies being a potential contributor to this stuff have all been folks that represent commercial portfolios, but those commercial portfolios have an awfully large Zero Trust footprint in a lot of cases.
I appreciate your enthusiasm, gentlemen.
If the problem's not big, why try to
just walking through my mind on the difference between a well-funded commercial product that's going to have to go through the rigor and all that stuff versus the open source community. And for like places that are extremely dynamic, like OpenCTI, I think there's like 100 changes a day. It's just, boy, a bunch of Energizer bunnies I found here, gentlemen. Now, of course, Duncan. Hello, Duncan. Nice to actually see you. Wow. So I'm coming into this late, gentlemen, but my head's spinning. I know the challenges we're having just to get a couple of these things working together, just in terms of not just the technical aspects of getting a particular API interface to work with the actual, okay, what's our criteria for taking this authentication thing versus a geolocation and unusual, and what's the waiting for this, and
remember, they're starting with crawl. They
specifically
use the word crawl.
Configuring this thing in a rational
and that's
way.
being liberal.
the technology might be like perfect, but just the process of trying to configure these things to make good decisions. We had a major incident that snuck under the wire just because the criteria just didn't get up to the threshold to where it went to a human being, and it was because of the artifacts of getting exploited that it came to attention. You go back and look at it and say, well, how come this didn't? This is, look, we did that for every time it happened. We're generating 1,000 alarms a day to the NUC. Anyway, I'm going off onto a tangent here, but there's, it's not just the functional aspects of A and B working together. It's the sort of the human part behind it. I know it's challenging. It's, it's what we got to do. But
so I think there's no doubt that the cure has unforeseen challenges to it. If we say that Zero Trust is a cure for supply chain or the way to realize supply chain attack and vulnerability resilience because of its aggressive compartmentalization. We're also saying you now have a bunch more log writers and event sources that need contextualized correlation and in order to arrive at some level of actionability. And we don't know how to do that yet. The amount of experience with operationalized zero trust conformance systems right now is near zero. Although there's some stood up in the military. I don't know how much have been production operationalized. In that, there are some challenges coming at us. But what we do know is that what we have been doing is not working in spades at scale across the ecosystem. Yep. And so I think there's an appetite for doing something different and disruptive, even though we don't have the answers to the complexity challenge, the signal to noise challenge, and of course, the disruption challenges that are going to be brought by this necessarily. And there's going to be economic fallout as well. This is disruptive enough in approach that it's shaking up ecosystems that have been long established, and everybody's scrambling for what does this mean for businesses, for economy, for budgets, for how do you move the ball forward. So we're not at the end of the complexities of this. But I think if we can get to the point where we can demonstrate efficacy and clear ways forward, and I just think that that demonstration winds up being something that clarifies what will be a lot of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, if that makes sense.
So we again, I apologize coming in this late. We believe there are suitable or enough measures in place out there to at least do some rudimentary stuff.
I think there are.
I think back to the Plug Fest, and I think maybe Duncan was one of your Plug Fests. There've been many I've been on the periphery of, but you know, just trying to get HTTP versus HTTPS SSL working. You know, ended up taking up 90% of the Plug Fest for 2 or 3 days. So you know, we're like a couple orders of magnitude above that in complexity here. So again, I salute your enthusiasm and energy.
Optimism.
We sort of have existence proof in OCA of we've already gotten a lot further than that. That's, you know, it just takes work.
Yep.
So here are the kinds of things in the commercial footprint that are being considered in concert to be part of one minimally viable zero trust constellation of stuff. If we can find open source capabilities that are one-for-one replacement of this kind of capability, and the integration can be standard integrations. Log files have been used to integrate this kind of stuff. Then I think we have the beginnings of what could be, if we get a critical mass of participation and collaboration, a way to move the ball forward significantly. I don't know that we'll find them all. Some of these are fed by ecosystems like mobile endpoint management and
Palo Alto. There's a lot of infrastructure required.
And the content production, the stream of rules that come down as part of the intelligence feeds that managed consumption of EDR, XDR, NDR, ... I think you're right. At the very same time, a lot of those products leverage open source capabilities to accelerate their own innovation within this domain. So as competition moves away from a particular area of functionality, it becomes more and more likely that that area of functionality becomes open source because it's not competitively differentiable. It becomes a sort of table stakes. And we're seeing some of that begin to occur in the market as well.
Is that just a typo where you say 1 of 8 instead of 1 of 10?
No, this is 1 of 8. There are 8 in the matrices as of the last update from the NCCOE. 8 permutations of that set of things that you see there in the list under example.
8 permutations.
So the 8 is not the list. The 8 is 8 combos of different bullets of the list.
8 different implementations. The list you see here is 1 implementation, 1 example.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
And there are 8 different ones.
Okay. Which are all enumerated on the NCCOE site.
So once we propose something to NIST and they agree, then we will get full access to at least the planning and use case kinds of documents. I don't know that they'll let us as an entity sit in on the collaborators meetings, but being able to get at what they're going to test and how they're going to configure so that we can shadow that with open source capabilities, or partially shadow it, find places where open source is a clear place to contribute, might be really useful. There are also places where we can ask questions that are farther out than the commercial environment exists right now. Analytics is going to be affected by this. Go ahead, sorry.
So I'm for doing this, but with some caveats. And that is, if we are going to do it, we probably need to do it right. And that means it's probably a PGB level decision, not the 5 of us or however many on this call level decision. And it will get into some tricky stuff because it does, like you said, we'll get access. We collectively, however we define we, which probably won't be anybody who feels like showing up at the meeting, because of the issue of we'll get access to documents that are all said and done a closed set of documents. So there's some weird interaction issues of how we interact with the NIST group that we'll have to have our ducks in a row. Otherwise, they probably won't give us access, or we'll get inundated with half the planet. I'm not sure which. But the other aspect, and the reason I think the PGB has to think about it a little bit, at least on this subset of 1 of 8, at least 3 of the bullet items are paying members of the OCA. That again, maybe their commercial interests aren't in us solving this problem well. I hope that's not the case, but at least it should go to them to get decided, and then hopefully they'll say yes and want to do it. And then if they do, then we maybe have alternate entrees in here as well. So we have to we'll have to keep straight whether someone's sort of operating as OCA when interacting with them, or operating as IBM or McAfee or Palo Alto or whoever. So there's some sort of ducks in a row we probably have to do. I'm all for doing it. I just think we better do our ducks in a row before we go big public on it.
Yeah, so Dee's informally invited me into this. Are there a set of legal documents that are required to participate in this OCA initiative? Much like the open source initiatives, is there something that
again, there are
I need to get our lawyers
rules, and OCA has some totally open to everybody stuff and some not as open stuff, and that's why we have to be clear. There's part of it that you have to be a paying member of to vote in, and there's part of it anybody can contribute to. Right now, this discussion is in the hey, anybody can show up and contribute to. The sort of decision to talk to NIST about a project is probably paying members all say yes, which I'm guessing they will, but they pay a lot of money, so that if they should at least have the right to say no, I guess. And
Absolutely.
then we'll have to get straight is if we do participate, would we, for example, would we make all of the NIST documentation that all said and done is a closed set of documentation available to absolutely everybody? So we'd basically be open sourcing something NIST has decided to be closed sourced. We got to make sure our ducks in a row if we're going to do that.
Yeah, we probably shouldn't do that. I think the sensitivity NIST has is to protecting the collaborators and the protocols and agreements that are in place there. The decisions NIST makes about testing, about standards, and all the other stuff are inherently open source and are used as federal product compliance and procurement criteria in the long run. So I don't see them needing to hide the stuff we need. I think the only thing we have to be firewalled about is NIST's evaluation of the capabilities of these products with respect to meeting their test objectives. Those tests, those are held pretty close to the vest because they're also controlled by the collaborator. The collaborator can vote and can say, I don't like how I scored on that, you can't disclose it. And so those are walls we can't go past, and NIST probably has a protocol for doing that. I think all we're looking at is saying, how far can we push the same proposition on open source and essentially leave it there, rather than looking at open source as a displacing mechanism for these capabilities. Maybe that's a pragmatic fact. We shouldn't wave that banner if we want a lot of cooperation. So.
Is this group primarily consisting of commercial interests?
The NCCOE, exclusively commercial participants, 33 of them now.
I'm talking about the
government, right?
OpenCA. OCA.
Oh, OCA, sorry.
Because there's two sides that I could facilitate here. We have, like, for example, our Zenki technology, which would be on the vendor side, versus our, hey, we're trying to make all this stuff work at the enterprise level for our organization. So there's that group of people that are trying to roll this stuff out as we speak and operationalize it. So there's two sides that I kind of straddle here. I'm just trying, again, Dee just invited me to come in, and I'm already quite pleased to meet all of you gentlemen and extend relationships like with Duncan.
So Patrick, the OCA has many projects. Okay, one you're probably particularly interested in would be the PACE project. That's one that was the one. Those
Stick shifters near and dear to my heart.
But that's one that I know your interests overlap with. This particular, but OCA in general is made up of a bunch of things, and there's different, and the members are commercial, but they're government also. I mean, they're government agencies that are members and stuff too. So I'm not exactly sure what you're asking.
No, just trying to understand. Trying to understand the context of
all of OCA. This is a particular task of a particular subgroup of OCA.
Yep. No, got it. Okay.
So the scope suggested by the questions, or that the technologies we'd evaluate, would be completely open source. Does that make sense, or does that help at all?
Carry on, gentlemen. I don't want to take you off point. I think just since I got the floor, the open source strikes me as a pretty ambitious objective.
Well, but recognize, Patrick, that there's 3 other projects already under OCA that are like Stick Shifter is a successful open source project.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not advocating. I'm just saying us evaluating the whole open source community for equivalence.
No, it's just, are there tools that might meet this particular need of this particular government group trying to do this particular thing? Since there's no one advocating for open source, and we're sort of an open source crowd, that's what this group is, would we be the logical ones? Would this be, for lack of a term, I'll call it a new business opportunity for OCA, but OCA is not a business, but I'm gonna use that term anyway. As far as, is this an area we should get into because we could help in this area?
Okay. And I'm a big supporter of Stick Shifter. I've been using variations of it since 2010, so I'm right there with you folks. That's not what I was trying to convey. I was just trying to say it. It just strikes me as a lot of work, and I see 5 people on here.
Yeah, well, the earlier call had 14, and they were different people, and the call before that, this is my 3rd OCA call today, had 8 people on it. So it's, again, and there's lots of pieces, moving parts to OCA. This is this topic.
Okay, I'm not by nature a jaded harumper. Okay, so I hope I don't come across that way. Although I'm transitioning more and more in that direction. I hate harumpers.
Dennis, do you have the other 7 of the 8?
I do, but I only have them in the NIST PowerPoint, and to the governance concerns earlier. Are you in the NCCOE?
Yeah, we are.
So it is the working group status document. I can tell you exactly where it is if that helps. It's working.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great.
Hold on, looking it up right this very second.
Yeah, and this is
group 1
being recorded meeting.
Yeah, this indirect reference doesn't help anybody. Working group 1, slides 49 and 50.
That's right. That could be anything.
I thought you were going to pop it up, and since you said you didn't.
Yeah, no, he was trying not
I'm
to.
trying not to be bad.
That's right. He's trying not to. I could tell.
Or at least not until NIST agrees to work with us.
Right.
Okay, that's good. Thanks. I mean, just because as I'm looking at that list,
the permutation there is across identity providers on the first set. So you see that column varying.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's, I think we have to, again, be a little careful. If it's not something we should be sharing, this is probably not the call to discuss it.
Yeah, I can jump off if you need.
It's not you, Patrick. It's me too. It's anybody who isn't on the NCCOE.
I actually maybe one of you gentlemen can tell me if AT&T is represented on that. Entirely
I
possible.
can guarantee you AT&T is, Patrick, and I can guarantee you you're not their rep.
Oh no, yeah, I can guarantee that too.
Be careful what you say.
Can you give me a name, or is that sensitive?
No, but I'm looking for AT&T being on that group. Hold on. All you have to do is hit NCCOE on their front page, and you see all the partners. Is very public information.
Yeah,
I'll tell you
I
in a
mean,
second.
my main objective here is to see if I can help broker and facilitate. My core interest is in sponsoring and facilitating interoperability, plug fest, whatever you want to call them, figuring out how to make this stuff play together. So that's my sort of objectives right now at this point, is to help facilitate those, help as these things actually get to the point where you have a practical chance of success to help make it happen.
Yeah, makes
So for
complete
example,
sense.
6.2.1 has kind of met that threshold of where it's actually usable, I think, and I'd like to put it to the test. But anyway, I'm taking your point. Go ahead, gentlemen.
It makes complete sense. I'm looking at the list of collaborators now, and AT&T is not in the explicit collaborator. Someone who signed the CRADA agreement has a representative in the working groups, but they certainly are relevant to sort of what this needs to do in the medium term and longer term. Right now,
go ahead.
Right now, these are just the guys trying to get a first demonstrated zero trust conformance solution out of existing technologies. That's sort of the objective of the NCCOE at this point. The NCCOE on zero trust. They have a lot of other stuff there.
Correct. Yeah, in the wider NCCOE, I am virtually positive, unless things have really changed since I left, AT&T is heavily involved in some other aspects of it.
Yeah, there's a whole telco CRADA.
I believe they chaired it when it was started, but.
So I think these questions are complex enough, and the context complex enough that maybe this is worth a little bit of thinking time. So why don't we anticipate getting back together on the next meeting and then weighing in on any concerns or any ideas about whether we should rein in the scope, stage it in a particular way, and how we might proceed, for instance, on establishing, if we decide to go forward on this, the appropriate governance kinds of guardrails. And have we lost Russ? Yes.
Oh, Russ is there.
Can we all set?
Oh, there he is. There he is.
Sorry, I think I broke up there. Thanks for sending the links too, guys, on that. So that helps. So yeah, I think that's a good suggestion, Dennis. I think there's some thoughts that we can have on this, and where we want to take it is the next step. I think it's a big question, so that would be good to think, contemplate. And we have a meeting, what, in 2 weeks? We'll have a discussion again on it. So we should have another meeting in a couple of weeks.
Great. In the meantime, I ought to have an update by then on the rest of the NIST stuff for the following slides, which were us getting a concise representation of what the rest of the objectives were for zero trust in their domain.
Sounds great.
I know it's on my queue. Over to you.
Okay, I think that's it for today's call. Anybody have anything else they wanted to add, or any other topics we wanted to cover in the next meeting? Otherwise, thanks everybody for your time and attention. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Have a good day.
Thanks, guys.